September 3rd, 2023. Dear Diary. Heathers the Musical is closing today, and I'm a little bit upset about it. Not just because it's a shame such a popular production is being taken off stage, and the really quite icky story about the bar staff being fired and then told to reapply for their own jobs. That's one part, but I'm mostly just sat here wondering, why couldn't you have done this 2 days ago? September 1st, 1989. It's the first line of the play. It was right there. How often do you get an opportunity like this? Full circle. Imagine the audience reaction to that line. Goodness me. And it was a Friday as well. It was all just so neat. Instead, it's happening on a Sunday, which is the opposite of neat, because some people think it's the end of the week, some people think it's the beginning of a new week, and it was on the 3rd, which doesn't have any significance whatsoever. It's just not very. It's not very at all. I hadn't seen Heathers till this January, and I'd actually avoided a lot of the music. I recognise that that is poor form, given, well, my mate originated the lead role in the UK. Sorry, Carrie. I did see Crown Jewels recently, though. Had a great time. And I've got about 8 tickets to Les Mis in my little ticket collection box, stretched over the course of 7 years. I think that's friendship. You can let me have this one. And although I had no prior context of the show and I hadn't seen the movie, I was very aware that there was a strong, passionate audience connection with this particular show. Like, I knew people enjoyed dressing up and going to see it, and her indoors, who I went to see it with, did like Heather's bounding. She wore like a red skirt. So I knew there would be a whole vibe, but nothing prepared me for the slap around the face of the passion, the fervour, frankly, the alarming levels of enthusiasm for this show as I walked into the theatre. And I had one of the cocktails. I think I had the green one. Now, I will say before I go any further, this is not a hit piece on the Heathers fandom. I say that for 2 reasons. Firstly, because when you do sort of analysis or you talk about a piece of media and you mention a particularly passionate fandom, it's very easy to slip into that kind of trap, that trope, if you will, of criticising a thing that young women especially like. Also, you all scare me and I want to stay on your good side. This is actually a video inspired by that enthusiasm because as I left the show, I was doing the thing I do whenever I leave the theatre or a movie, which is to read every review I can possibly find and see how they align with my initial responses. And after having really, really loved the show, I was surprised to find a lot of the reviews were actually very mid. Critics aren't always right, to say that up front. They are just opinions after all. They're good opinions. They're like well-researched, super informed opinions, but they are opinions nonetheless. And especially when it comes to popular theatre, there's a really interesting sort of dissonance between audience response and critical response. I think of Les Mis. The critics hated Les Mis, and it's been around for a hot sec. Some of them were 2 stars, some of them were 3 stars, but the one thing they all seemed to agree on was that the musical took quite a departure from the dark tone of the movie on which it's based. And that's really interesting to me, specifically because it speaks to the process of adaptation, and that's something that was my area of study while I was at university. I wrote a whole dissertation on adapting a book to a film. In this case, while a stage show does depart from the movie quite drastically in a number of different ways, it hasn't stopped the show finding a passionate audience, which is genuinely really impressive, especially when it comes to musical theatre. Stage to screen, screen to stage has a tumultuous relationship. Some of it can be done really, really well. Some of it just fundamentally misunderstands the individual mediums and what makes them work. And I find that particularly fascinating. That's a whole other thing I could talk about. But as I was writing this video, I was going too far away from the topic at hand, which is why has this show worked twice? So what has made both versions of Heathers in 2 different formats with 2 completely different tones become such a cult classic for 2 completely separate generations 30 years apart? In classic Dan Layton fashion, I've overthought it a lot, which means I have a lot to say. So let's focus it in, but make sure we're fed and watered to begin with. And I'm thrilled to say that I can help you with that because of this week's sponsor. Sponsorship, Dan. Why, thank you, main video, Dan. How very kind of you, and how even kinder that this video is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service. Each week you pick recipes from a wide variety of options, and the ingredients get delivered straight to your door. All you have to do is open the box, pick what you fancy eating that night, and get cooking. That's it. It is so simple. And there are so many options to choose from, like meat, fish, vegetarian, recipes with an international flavour, family favourites, quick cook. If you just want to get the dinner straight on the table, it's completely up to you. I'm always looking for an opportunity to start a clean page, and even 10 years after leaving university, I'm still programmed. My body clock feels like September is an opportunity for a new start. Like right now, I have the overwhelming urge to go out and buy some stationery. So after a summer of girl dinner and takeout and picking up something last minute on the way home from the gig, I'm looking to get back into a normal routine. And if you want to join me on that and we can make ourselves some fresh, home-cooked meals to start our new year, then this will get you right on track. Every recipe comes with a card and step-by-step picture instructions, so you just have to pick the recipe, get out the ingredients, and start cooking. Big fun! There are no commitments, it's fully customizable, you can add more portion sizes or more recipes as and when you choose, and you can pause and cancel your subscription anytime you want. If you've been hovering around HelloFresh for a little while and thinking, yeah, you know what, I might give that a try, well, now's the time because I got the code for you. Go ahead and be new age and scan this QR code, or use the link in the description with this code to get yourself 60% off your first box and 25% off your next 8 boxes. Cripes, what a saving! And then go on the internet and take pictures of the food that you've made and send it to me so that we can all be cooking and eating together. Thank you very much for HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. In the meantime, back over to Main Video Dan. Main Video Dan, your turn. Well, wasn't that lovely? So lovely that I can't think of a segue, so let's dive right back in. Here's the thing. This week I watched the original movie and the live recording of the show at the other palace, basically 2 days in a row. And what was so interesting to me was the fact that there are so many radical departures in the musical from the tone, the message, the style, the colour palette in a way, the things that made the movie such a cult hit, and yet that hadn't stopped the musical from becoming such a cult hit. And I started developing a little theory that it was down to your generation and times you've lived through, the media with which you've been presented, the world with which you've had to navigate, and what you want your movies to do. Because teen movies are a really fascinating thing, right? Every generation has their own teen movie, and the interesting thing, to me at least, is that usually the term generation is quite broad. It's like 15 years. But teendom, I would argue, when we think of a generation of teens, is actually a very specific, shorter period of time. And I think it's usually sort of between 14 to 18, probably more specifically 16 to 18. And when I think about that, the way I'd explain it is, I was 16 in 2006, so Shakira's Hips Don't Lie is a song that you might really like, but it's a song I absolutely adore, and it's one that is very connected to my experience of going to school. If you were in sixth form just 3 years later, we're not that far apart in age, but your experience of sixth form, for Americans that's junior and senior year, your song is probably something like Boom Boom Pow by the Black Eyed Peas, or Just Dance by Lady Gaga, which for me is a very different period of my life. That's when I'm sort of going to university, becoming an adult. If we focus it in on movies, for instance, my mate Luke and I are both millennials. He's about 6 years older than me, I think. So if we both watch American Pie, we're gonna love it, because American Pie is a great movie, but I don't recognize any of my high school experience in that movie, musically, fashion-wise, culture-wise, whereas Luke kind of feels like, oh, I recognize some of my life in that. Meanwhile, mine is something like Skins. Now, my life was nowhere near as grotty as Skins, so when you look at the clothes they're wearing, or the haircuts they have, or the music they're listening to, that's my life. And if a Gen Z 16-year-old was going to watch Skins now, they wouldn't recognize their experience. They'd probably see similarities in certain places, but it doesn't feel as specifically connected to their time. Point being, Heathers the movie is a sort of nihilistic, life is meaningless, very cynical, acerbic, satirical takedown of the pop culture of the time, which when you look at like teen movies was very much John Hughes, that kind of coming of age, everyone has a story, everyone has meaning, quite hopeful, Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, etc. And Heathers is like the diametric opposite of that. And that kind of nihilism is so actively Gen X. When you think about it, Heathers the movie has far more in common with something like Fight Club than it does with something like 10 Things I Hate About You. A lot of this is sort of hypothesis, but the time that Heathers came out was like, I think it was about 10 years into Republican administration. George H.W. Bush was the president. Everything was very dark and very bleak. They'd lived through the AIDS crisis, were still living through the AIDS crisis. Cold War was ending and the Gulf War was just beginning. There was an awful lot of very dark stuff going on in culture, and that kind of nihilism, the idea of like life is a bit meaningless, almost is a coping mechanism, I suppose. It's a way of seeing the world, and art is a way of trying to reflect the world. That's the point of Heathers. The idea that the high school experience is a dark comedy, that you might be going through it, but none of this matters because life is meaningless, is JD's entire reason d'etre. When you contrast that with Heathers the musical, It's the complete opposite. It's primary colours. It's light, it's bright, it's campy, it's singy, it's dancey. And not just because it's a musical, because if you think musicals are inherently campy and singy and dancey, I'm gonna point you in the way of things like Sweeney Todd. They can be really camp, but they can also be really serious. And this was an active choice to go in that different direction. The very first song in Heathers, the line is, "I know life can be beautiful," which is diametrically opposed to the nihilistic, "I know life is meaningless." It's a story of hope. It's a story of finding depth and identity in everyone around you and forging a connection and making it through together, which is not what Heathers the movie is. And yet, I had this working theory that current generations of Heathers fans would prefer the musical for that particular reason. Everything is still bleak, everything is still dark. Economically speaking, geopolitically speaking, there's a war in Ukraine at the moment. LGBTQ plus people are fighting for their basic human rights. Women's rights are being restricted all over the world. Rampant greed is causing a huge economic gap between the people at the very top and the people at the very bottom. And the rise of social media has led a lot of people to feel a very serious state of despair, I guess, at the state of the world. Gen Z's response to that is, in a way, fostering community and finding humor in things. That's why TikTok is so big, I suppose. It's people sharing videos of something funny that they've seen, or doing a dance together, or jumping on a trend together. A lot of this, to be clear, is very hypothetical. I don't actually know this to be specifically true. It's just my reading of the situation and my reading of pop culture, and I would love to know your opinion too. And in fact, that's why I went to Twitter to try and get the opinion of people who are fans of both the movie and the musical and see which is it that you prefer and why. And the overwhelming response that I got was that people preferred the musical because it added depth to the characters and because it gave them a sense of hope and because it was so much lighter, more fun. When you remove that "I just like musicals and singing and dancing" people and the "I just believe in Winona Ryder supremacy" people who have their preferences in media, and you're just listening to the people who have thought about it on that level, whether they know they've thought about it on that level or not. I had someone say, "I haven't intellectualized it." I don't think it's intellectualizing it. I think it's just your inherent personal response to a piece of art. I don't think that necessarily has to be intellectual. It's just responding to a thing that you love. And I want to encourage that in so many people because that's why we make the things in the first place, to make you feel shit. So, where I'm rambling, and this is what I was talking about, this could be a whole video in and of itself, probably will be. Maybe I'll do a series of deep dives into the best musicals in the history of the stage. Let me know if you'd like to see it. I'm gonna specifically boil down on a couple of things that were spoken about as reasons people prefer the musical. One of them is in the plot. In the movie, Veronica's already one of the Heathers, and as a result, they argue she goes on less of a journey. And that's really interesting to me because I perceived the movie as starting in a sense of stasis. This is the status quo, don't mess with it. And in the musical, you get that too, especially in the monologue that Heather Chandler has about, "You're gonna experience chaos and look back on my reign as sort of peaceful." What was their exact line? I can't remember. "The buses ran on time, the yearbook came out, everything was good, and now you've entered chaos." Which is kind of the language of tyranny, and I find that really interesting. Okay, focus. So the movie, status quo exists, and then over the course of it, Veronica starts delving into the nihilism. She has this relationship with JD. She's a more active part of the killing and the murder that goes on. She starts realizing that this status quo will never go away. She has that conversation with her parents where she says, "We just want to be treated like humans." Her mum says a really fucking amazing line about, "What do you think adults do? What you ask us to treat you like adults, so we start treating you like adults and you don't like it." It's an amazing line. I love it because it says that this is what the world's like, Veronica, get used to it. And so Veronica ultimately makes the decision to break the wheel and make friends with Martha. Stick a pin in Martha, we're gonna come back to it. In the stage, it's really interesting then that we get a whole introduction to Veronica as very unheathered. She's wearing a lot of baggy clothes, she's writing in her journal, she's actively stated to be not one of the popular kids, and then she goes through a Cinderella-like transformation to become one of the Heathers, which is so Mean Girls. And that's a really interesting look at the symbiotic relationship between Mean Girls and Heathers, because Mean Girls doesn't exist without Heathers, and now Heathers the musical has flavors of Mean Girls. And also another tangent, I'm really sorry, but the whole idea of YA fiction becoming what teen movies are in the sort of 2010s, 2012s, which is this sort of dystopian future. You have all the tropes of a teen movie, love triangles, and just wanting to fit in and not understanding the world around you and wanting to be treated like an adult but not knowing how to do it in movies like The Hunger Games, Divergent, etc. But it's all set in a dystopian future, and it's almost like a response to that is we actually want teen movies back again, but we'll just turn them into musicals, like Mean Girls musical. Anyway, I'm moving on. I think both of those viewpoints and both of those journeys for Veronica are really narratively satisfying. The idea that she wanted to become one of the popular kids, she got carried away because she can't escape from being one of the unpopular kids with JD. She's always tied to Martha. You can't really be anything other than yourself. It's this idea of authenticity. Authenticity in your character. That takes us onto the characters. Let's go. Because the other thing people were talking about was how they liked the way the characters were given more depth and fleshed out in the musical, and that's inarguable. In the movie, what's so interesting is that JD basically says, none of these characters have depth. That's why we're okay killing them. He says Kurt and Ram had nothing left to offer the school because the football season was over, so it's not a problem. And the biting satire that comes after the suicides of these kids, where all of their friends and family come out and they say, I didn't realise they had so much depth to them. Well, the comedy there comes from we as the audience knowing they actually didn't have any of that depth, and that depth has been artificially placed on them. And it's almost like we as a collective community feel better about ourselves because of the way that we're all responding to this sort of tragedy. That's a really interesting piece of satire. So there's something actually really authentic about these people acting the way they are because they have no depth. Contrast that with a musical, everyone is sort of behaving in a very inauthentic way. Very specifically in the opening number, you do have those moments of people stopping and singing directly to the audience. I can't remember which one it is, it's either Kurt or Ram, but one of them says, why do I act like such a creep? Which shows a level of self-awareness that is so not present in the movie and changes the character because it makes it seem like you know you're being a dick, but you're choosing to be a dick anyway. RuPaul says, you're born naked and the rest is drag, and I've never seen a more pinpoint precise summation of human existence than that. Because what it's essentially saying is, we enter the world and then everything else becomes a performance. Everything becomes performative. We create a character, partly in self-defense, but also partly to get the things that we want in life. So whereas in the movie, Kurt and Ram are acting a certain way because that's just who they are and there is no artifice to it, in the musical, we are told, in the space of that line, why do I act like such a creep, that there is artifice to it. He knows he's acting like a creep and is doing it anyway. So it's a performance in order to get the status, the power that he really wants. And that changes the character, which in turn changes the story, and I find that really fascinating. And interestingly, the only person in both the movie and the musical who I believe is 100% authentic is Martha Dunstock, which is so interesting because someone replied to me saying that they took Martha, who wasn't a pivotal character in the movie, and they fleshed her out. And in some ways that's true. They took the character of Betty and Martha and they combined them into one, which sort of bolsters Veronica's connection to this person and also helps to flesh out Veronica's backstory. But the suggestion that Martha isn't a pivotal character in the movie is so off base, I think. She is quite literally the pivot around which the movie goes. The movie begins not with Veronica forging something to join the Heathers, with Veronica very much already a part of the Heathers. The very first thing she does that causes a little question mark to pop up over her head and question whether the status quo is something she wants to maintain is the Heathers make her forge a letter from Ram to Martha. And she's like, this doesn't feel fun, this doesn't feel nice, I don't know if I want to do this. In the middle of the movie, the sort of incident that changes Veronica completely and really makes her see the horror of everything that's going on is Martha's attempt at suicide, which is the only real attempt at suicide in this. Obviously, the others are all murders that are covered up as suicides. And the response to Martha's attempt at suicide, specifically from Heather Duke, is this idea that Martha just wanted to get in with the popular kids and she failed at that. And that's such a horrific line to Veronica and to the audience that it changes the course of the film. So then right at the end of the movie, to close everything off, it's specifically Martha who doesn't look, sound, or behave like any of the status quo. It's Martha that Veronica chooses to break the wheel with and form this new world. Martha is the pivotal character. And the same is true in the musical, because Martha in the musical is the only one who behaves in any way. It's not Veronica. She's pretending to be a Heather the whole time. It's not even JD, because while he's very upfront about his nihilistic worldview, he's also covering things up and he lies to Veronica about the bullets. So he's pretending that this isn't what it's going to be to get her on side. The Heathers, by virtue of their costumes and the way that they parade around, they are in drag. They are not being their authentic self. Even the teacher, what is her name? I'm so sorry, I've completely forgotten. She's my favourite part in the whole musical. And the actress who plays her in this, I think it's Vicky Lee Turner, is fucking sensational. But the teacher isn't authentic either, because they're giving it about the, oh, we're caring for the kids, we're caring for the kids. They care far more, both in the movie and in the musical, about the cameras and about the attention, about the opportunity to perform. Martha is the only one in the musical who is entirely and completely authentic. She's a brilliant character, her song is beautiful, I love Martha, and the interesting thing to me, and here's where I go into potentially another part of the big deep dive video, nobody, to my experience, seems to cosplay as Martha. I'm sure that there are people who do, I'm sure that there are people who have gone to conventions or have posted TikToks being Martha, but it just seems to me, with the crowd reaction in the show, and the way the audiences that I have seen when I've been both to plays, Heathers itself, but also to the downstairs plays at the other palace, most people are dressing up as the Heathers. They're dressing up as the people right at the top of the food chain. Nobody's dressing up as the most authentic character. That's really interesting to me. Tell me what you think about that. I've gone on for far too long, and I think it's very clear that I wanted to pursue this on another way. But I didn't want to mark today, the last day of Heathers, this musical that has come out of nowhere and really captured my imagination and the imaginations of thousands, nay millions perhaps, of people across the world. I didn't want to mark this day of it closing without exploring those ideas at least a little bit. Thanks for watching this rambly mess of a video. Please do let me know if you'd like to have more kind of deep divey, thoughtful videos about this. Anyway, God love you. Thanks to HelloFresh for sponsoring the video. Links in the description. Please do like, subscribe, all the rest of it. Have a wonderful day, and don't forget to be very